on projects with partners in Kenya, and more recently, rapid assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on sex workers in Nairobi. Sanders also works in collaboration with practitioners from organizations such as the Revenge Porn Helpline, engaging research to inform best practice. She has received a Leverhulme Research Fellowship from 2019 to 2021 to conduct a re-study reflecting on a 20-year period of brothel work. She's currently working on 2 UKRI-funded projects. One is a multidisciplinary international research project with peers on an ESRC grant about understanding sexual violence in sex working populations, law, legal consciousness, and legal practice in 4 countries, and that runs until 2024. And another project is an AHRC-funded project via the Modern Slavery Policy Evidence Center on prevention of modern slavery within the sex industry, within sex work, the role of adult services websites, and that's until 2023. Her keynote speech today is titled, "How do we tackle stigma against sex workers?" And the talk will be followed by Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'll present them to Teela following her talk. You can write them in English or in Hebrew, and I will translate. So thank you all, and thank you, Teela, most of all. And the floor is yours. And you can also share screen. I see you're already sharing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's just so great to be here. Obviously, connections have happened over the last couple of years with Yila and Noor also coming over to Leicester and teaching me more about what's happening in Israel and forging those relationships. So it's really great to be here and to see the work and the community developing and becoming more inclusive over in Israel. So thank you for inviting me. It is really great. And great to see the themes of the conference. So today, let me see if this works. Yeah, and thanks for Yila, even though she's not here, she has done the interpretation for me, translation, so that's a real help. I don't claim to have any skills in languages whatsoever. So, so yeah, the kind of topic around stigma. So I would say, in lots of ways, I haven't really studied stigma. Like, there are people who are doing actual proper projects, like Dr. Lindsay Armstrong from New Zealand, who's doing a project on stigma at the moment. But in the same breath, I guess I've been still studying stigma for the whole 20+ years of me doing research in the sex industry with sex work communities, because ultimately we know that sex work and stigma are synonymous, often even in spaces where it's not criminalized. We know the evidence for the pervasiveness of stigma is presented in abundance as everyday lives of sex workers and those who are directly or indirectly involved in sex work and the related industries are marred by public disapproval and structural prejudices. Often the readings of these everyday experiences of moral judgments, of discrimination, marginalisation, victimisation, and the effects of courtesy stigma, which I'll talk about, offers a real bleak analysis of how society views and treats sex workers. Often we know about the effects of stigma as researchers, as practitioners, as activists. We see the evidence of stigma, negativity, isolation, passivity. And the more we learn about the coping strategies and the management techniques employed by individuals to keep their work and their identity secret and deal with potential emotional fallouts, negative feelings such as guilt and shame, we understand that the spaces for sex workers become harder to resist punitive abolitionist ideas and ideologies. The stigma weighs heavy. And what this slide does really is that it answers the question, why are we still talking about stigma? You know, we really don't want to be doing this. How many years on from having progressive and extensive research in this area and activism, we don't want to be talking about stigma, but the levels of global violence, particularly against marginalised sex workers or more minority groups of sex workers, is really quite evident of the far-reaching tentacles of that stigma has. We have increasing abolitionist laws introduced to try and eradicate these strong moral ideologies, often driven by the modern slavery and trafficking agendas, which dominates politics, particularly in the West. So we have very few places where decriminalisation or legalisation models prevail, which could be a route into a destigmatising project or process. We know the effects of stigma are really well documented across the globe. And when I was thinking about this talk, I went back to one of my first book that I wrote in 2005 called A Risky Business. And there's a chapter in there on secrecy and stigma. And it's just evidence that these things have not gone away, despite the modernisation project around mainstreaming and some changes in attitudes towards sexual labour particularly, or the sex industry more broadly. The stigma prevails quite intensely. And we see courtesy stigma. So this is a term that Irving Goffman uses. Courtesy stigma, which ultimately is those people around the stigmatized individual or identity ultimately affects. And that has academics been written about this as well. As an academic doing this work, the stigma within the academy is felt quite heavily. So we know the stigma knowledge base is extensive, and I'm sure people on this call have got their own accounts, either through research or lived experiences around that. The stigma knowledge base is extensive, but perhaps theorising about that is less so. So I want to say the reasons why we're talking about stigma are really quite evident still. It's still very highly relevant, and some would say that stigma kills. So I think we should keep revisiting. It's great to have this theme as the conference and whatever comes from it going forward, to keep the realities of people's lives on the agenda for individuals. Often stigma can just be pushed away, but I think having this in the forefront is really quite important. It brings us back to the central arguments and ideas around sex worker rights. But the theorising then, as a sociologist, as a criminologically informed sociologist, it's important for us to think about and try and theorise a little bit more around this concept of stigma, and to think it through more from an intellectual perspective in order to inform the everyday and the practice that we do in our various roles and perspectives. So I turn here to Ronald Weitzer's work. I was part of a collection of essays in the journal Sexualities in 2018, and Ron Weitzer led on a piece around stigma and the sex industry, and I was able to write a response, as with several others. So it's quite a useful collection there to think about how we think about stigma in the everyday with sex work in sex work communities. Weitzer is a little bit more optimistic, and he says that stigma is not an immutable constant. So it's not something that should be static or permanent or intrinsic, but it's variable dimension. And I think it's this notion of it being a variable dimension is what I want to explore today, and seeing how we can all, everybody on the call, take part in that destigmatization project, or take part in the process of working against anti-sex work rhetoric, to think more about our roles in the everyday. So Weitzer talks about how it should not be inevitable in a society, and it should not be inevitable in an individual's identity. It should not be an intrinsic part of a characteristic that sex workers or people involved in the sex industry more broadly should have to take on, and we can resist that. So he's quite optimistic looking forward to what he calls the preconditions of normalization around the concept of stigma, so that we can try to think about ways in which we can defeat the structural embeddedness of stigma in our society. So we know ultimately that stigma is culturally reproduced. Lots of ways. We can just think of the word prostitute or the word whore, and the way that just language is one of those examples of how cultural reproduction happens in the meaning of everyday life. And that stigma is really structurally and systemically ingrained in societies and how they operate, ultimately, the landscape and the structures of society. But Weitz's call is really to say that because stigma is so culturally reproduced, then it needs to have quite a dynamic shift to see any change, and that we need to work out how to make those dynamic shifts ultimately. One of those shifts obviously comes through the law. We've probably got legal scholars, legal practitioners on the call today about the power of legal reform. And my colleague Jane Schooler talks a lot about this in relation to the importance of the law, how the law has the power to construct space, subjects and systems of governance. And that it is the regulation of sex work there that we can really look to be a really strong force in the changes of the dynamics around stigma. We can see this in various models across the world. The Nordic model coming from Sweden, Scandinavia, which tries to use the law to ban, to eradicate, to send out those very symbolic messages. But in New Zealand, it's quite opposite to that. And it's interesting to see there in relation to lived experiences of stigma, how that people who carry on doing sex work in Scandinavia have a very different experience to those who have a much more embedded sex worker rights experiences in New Zealand. So the law is really quite important in our fight against stigma, or thinking about a destigmatization project. The law has the power to influence normative discourses around the rights of sex workers, and we've seen that in the West, particularly around sexuality in the law, more generally how the law is used. However, this happened recently. I'm not sure if people on the call are aware of what's happened in India more recently, and this goes to show that law is not enough. So in India, there is legalization, decriminalization models across the different states, but yet still there's real strong discrimination, abuse, particularly by the police. And it was recently that the Supreme Court ordered the police to respect prostitutes' rights there. And it just goes to demonstrate that the law can be one thing, but in practice cannot be interpreted or embedded there. So law is not enough, even where there may be a more favourable sex worker rights governance model, abuses can still happen. And this judgment is a really interesting example, and the report came, and the law case came from the Centre for Advocacy on Stigma and Marginalisation of the NGO group there, who really fought very hard for the status of sex workers to be understood in a much more non-judgmental way. So this image here is of a rally in Calcutta in India in April to support the protection of the constitutional rights of sex workers. So it just goes to demonstrate really that law is not always enough. So one of the areas that I'm working in and have been doing for a little while is the notion around regulation and governance of online spaces. As you know, I'm sure it's quite similar in Israel. I remember from Yila's work, particularly around the movement of the sex industries, sex markets online. Clearly that's happened even more so in the last couple of years, but reflects a decade of movement there. And it's interesting to think about these spaces, and are they part of a stigmatizing project or a destigmatizing project? What's happening in these online spaces as people's workplaces ultimately? Lots of NGOs and sex work communities advocate that regulation of online spaces can be done within sex work communities. And we've demonstrated from our research on Beyond the Gaze that sex work is much safer when it's advertised or obviously delivered through online spaces, and that when you hand over the control of online spaces to sex workers, it's a much stronger way of encouraging better working conditions, better working practices. At the moment in the UK, we have a law going through the very long parliamentary process. It's called the Online Safety Bill. The intention, it's not about sex work, the intention is about social media companies, particularly charging them with the responsibility to protect children and adults from harmful content. More recently, there has been a clause included which reflects existing laws. So it's not a new law, but it just charges social media companies for ultimately being responsible for promoting harmful content. And many sex workers see this as a backdoor way to introduce in what happened in the US in 2018 with the Leicester laws that were introduced there, which really had devastating effects on the online sex markets. I'm pleased to say that I'm involved with the process of this lawmaking and trying to influence, as is the police. The police don't want to have any more criminalisation. They ultimately don't want to create underground worlds where they can't have access to where real crimes are happening. So it's useful to try and think about how these online spaces, which some of them do need regulation, but where does that regulation come from? Can it come from self-regulation? Can it come from codes of practice? Does there have to be heavy-handed law? Would such laws start to criminalise online content, for example? Would it start to have negative impacts on sex workers' livelihoods? And for me, the question is it's around the adult service platforms. I'm starting to work with those, particularly, they're businesses, they're not that interested in sex work, but they use sex work as a way of making lots of profit. Would it mean that those platforms that are roots to people's livelihoods, do they become less interested in promoting or having profiles around sexual services? So will there be an indirect effect ultimately on sex workers, even if they're not directly involved in the law? So these questions really about the online spaces are very much about how much can the neoliberal project around us engage in the liberal projects. I mean, this is the Elon Musks of the world who want this liberal space of online communication. How can that really support sex workers? Or is it something that ultimately governments are going to harness and hanker down, which will increase the stigma against sex workers? Well, some sex workers and academics have already thought about this. And if you do have a chance to reach out to this group of people in the States, working out of some of the New York universities, they've really got this this thinking kind of sewed up in terms of thinking about how sex workers can get involved or are already involved in technological advances and control to make sure that the online spaces are controlled by sex workers, developed by sex workers, that sex workers are at the innovation. So there's this new collective called Decoding Stigma, the Decoding Stigma Project. It's hoping to bring together sex work, technology, academia, and it is already doing that in order to prioritise ideas around sexual autonomy as a necessary ethics question for researchers and technologists, and to celebrate that these spaces, online spaces, could be a space where those who are sexually stigmatized become amplified and celebrated. So in these online spaces, there is the chance there to push forward this destigmatization project. What they argue, and it's very clear, and they put it very succinctly, that whorephobia is very, very present in technology and technological spaces. It becomes encoded in technological design, despite the historical relationship that sex work is at the forefront of technological development. And that sexual labour, particularly think about the pornography industry, camming industries, sexual labour being part of those technological developments. The relationship between the webcam and sexual labour is really quite historic now, that developing as a technology. And look how much we all rely on the webcam, right? But despite the fact that sex work and technology have always gone together in terms of innovation, there has been really deep-rooted whorephobic structures in that technological design. And we can see that with the fallout of Leicester, where online spaces were closed down overnight people were put in prison, people lost their livelihoods, money was taken away from sex workers. And it was really quite devastating the way that was used. And we continually hear, and you may hear as well, in an Israeli context, of internet platforms closing down accounts, taking off profiles, really infringing on sex workers' ability to earn money. Various terms and conditions changed as a result of Sester Foster, Google particularly, Twitter, etc., Facebook, all the big giants really pushing away any elements of sexual labour wanting to be associated with. So whilst we know that sex workers are the innovators and they are the early adopters of all these new technologies, there is a real issue that sex workers are becoming the collateral damage. So now internet companies are up and running and incredibly successful and self-sustaining. Sex work industry has really been pushed out on its own. So we need to think about overarching policies that start to try and prohibit sexual communication, particularly, or sexual expression, and to resist these changes online. So this very much comes back to the Sester Foster developments, which are seeing the ripples of that, like we say, in the UK and no doubt beyond. There are other ways that we are understanding a lot more about in relation to stigma and how it affects sex work community particularly. And here I'll refer to some recent research done by an important NGO in the UK called National Ugly Mugs. And when these slides come out, click on the link. They have done a really great piece of work about financial discrimination. It's called Payment Rejected, and really goes in depth around the financial discrimination against sex workers from banks and other financial institutions. We saw this happening in Sester Foster, and we can see it and evidence it. The refusal of services, business accounts, overdrafts, loans, other types of financial products. People who are self-employed in this country find it tricky anyway, often trying to get things like mortgages for houses, etc. But it creates another world of complexity and rejection where sex work, which is legal, where sex work is seen to be a form of employment. So this project really does evidence how personal bank accounts are shut down, frozen, money can't be accessed. And with the increasing digitization of payments, I'm not sure what's happening in Israel, but increasingly you can't use cash. You can't use cash in the UK economy like you used to. It's all contactless. And that is obviously very, very alienating for many groups in society, particularly for sex workers. So there's a real issue here around financial discrimination. That's all tied up in our structural ideas around the viability and the acceptability of sex work. So people who are obviously experiencing financial discrimination, it can have quite detrimental effects in terms of mental health, extreme anxiety and depression, feeling of being excluded and not having any control over one's finances. So there's real issues with this element of financial discrimination. So that's something that's being picked up here with the, I think it's being picked up where there's a body called Financial Regulation Board, and trying to be picked up on that level to try and think about how banks can change their policies ultimately. Another area that I have been working in is in relation to universities and higher education, and Nora's been involved in some of this, and do encourage people on this call to get involved in some of the training, or quite happy to put on a special session for people as part of your network. So it's not new information that students who engage in sex work while they're at university have experienced a whole list of these things that are on this slide, which are essentially kind of stigma related. We've been gathering some of those testimonies over recent years at a national level. We've had all kinds of experiences of individuals who've been blackmailed by lecturers, kicked out by landlords, kind of outed by peers, all the kinds of things that ultimately really affect quality of life. The worst really is people being excluded from their courses, being kicked off their degrees, particularly in areas that are connected to other types of vulnerable people, such as children, teaching, education, for example, anything to do with health. So we've had some really quite awful testimonies that have ruined people's lives, ultimately, been sent in. So what we did about this is that we set up a programme to educate universities around what sex work is, why sex workers engage, what is their experiences, particularly over COVID, when in the UK all the informal economies, all the leisure hospitality industries were closed down. There was an increase in people using online spaces for sex work, particularly webcamming, indirect services. So we have this programme that ultimately goes out to universities and educates frontline staff. So it's not necessarily academics, although they probably do need a lot of educating. It's not true that all academics understand what sex work is, but it's often pastoral, counsellors, people involved in student services. A very large part of universities, probably 40% really, of university staff are really made up of student support services these days. It's very significant in the UK. So we've had a big programme, and we went to 58 universities last year, and over 1,000 people came on our course. So we do a level 1 course, and then we do a level 2 course, which is about disclosure. So if someone discloses their sex work, how are you appropriately meant to react and interact with those individuals. So we kind of see in universities really as a space where lots of stigma happens. That can be part of a destigmatising project there, particularly through student unions, are often leading the way around sex worker rights. So that outreach programme has been really quite successful, although possibly the most difficult in terms of complaints and reactions from abolitionist groups of all the projects I've been involved with. Another project, back to speaking about National Ugly Mugs, around something that's new, that's kind of fairly new in the literature, but the discrimination in mainstream employment. So we're starting to learn about the long-term stigma of sex work that sex workers are experiencing. So after sex work, staying with people, particularly we're finding that people's digital footprints is really quite difficult to eradicate and get rid of. So if you've done anything online, it can be quite difficult to get rid of that digital footprint, and essentially coming back to the haunt in the sense that people who are going into mainstream jobs or trying to get into mainstream education, for example, are still being stigmatized by previous engagements. So thinking around there, and there is a little clip which is really quite useful to think about how normalization works and kind of how people need support in really when they do transition, or if people do transition to other types of jobs. So really trying to address how we think about normalization and prevention of discrimination in the workplace. So for me, this goes back to the other slide as well around student sex work. Universities should not be stigmatizing workplaces. There's increasingly more sex worker academics coming through and being clear about their own experiences and lived experiences, and that should only be celebrated essentially, and not stigmatized. So looking at the workplace is really important. So this is my last slide then before we get some feedback and discussion going. So I'm really keen to think about destigmatisation, a roadmap for destigmatisation, and some of Weitz's work really looks at how we can start to develop an evidence-based policy and practice to reduce stigma, to fight against some of the negativity that we've talked about today. And these are some of the things that he proposes we should try and harness. Neutralisation of language, really important. Language, as we know, is connected to power hierarchies. The place of language in perpetuating stigma is really, really important. And I think if anything people can do is thinking about the language that they use and not being a bystander when other people use language that's negative and stigmatizing. So the place of language is really important in perpetuating stereotypes and myths about certain groups, and that is incredibly the case for sex work and sex workers. So thinking about language is really important. And I have to say, one of the things I'm really proud about is that I sit on a high level policing working group, national policing working group here. And my conversations with the chief of police over time has led him to realise the importance of this. And the word prostitution is dropped from the name of the working group. So it's sex work and policing, which is really quite significant for the police, who ultimately are the ones that have to, well, they don't have to, there's discretion, but the ones that are seen to be law enforcers of the laws that talk about prostitution. So the fact that the police have, and it's taken some time and a concerted effort from lots and lots of people to really think about neutralisation of language. I think that's really key, and we can all do that in the way that we work. Media, now media is really tricky one, and we know the media can be incredibly hostile, stereotypical, voyeuristic, all the negatives there. But there is critical media, and there is spaces for critical media, and it's trying to engage them there and trying to work and find out those spaces and find out those allies in the media that can bring a much more critical, nuanced view of what's happening. Decriminalisation, don't really need to talk too much about that one, but again, the slow process of legal reform by understanding the ways that law can be a key mechanism of change is really quite important. Industry mobilisation, so essentially pointing here to third parties involved in the sex industry, so owners, managers, promoters, their role in resisting stigma is really important. We often forget about that, and the ancillary people involved in the sex industry. Sex worker activism, obviously really key and at the fore of sex worker rights campaigns, but sex worker activism is most clearly at the forefront of education and challenging and promoting the rights of sex workers in the fight for decriminalisation. And then finally, I come to the academic community, of which some of us are from. So whilst the academic community is continually met with mixed engagement in terms of, are we part of the problem or part of the solution? I think ultimately we can be and we should be seen collectively as an ally on that stigma, particularly is an area that we can continue to research, continue to talk about, to continue to work against, where our research is seen as practice and our research engages practice. As I said before, it's ultimately from my research projects that I've been able to influence policy, and the language example that I gave is one that I think is quite a successful one. So that's what I've got to say today, really, and really want to, if you like, think about how we can all be part of this destigmatization project, the destigmatization roadmap, where we can use our evidence, whether it's lived experience, whether it's research, whether it's practice, well, we can use that to inform what we do and influence what other people do. So that's all from me today. So hopefully we can have some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Teela, for this very, very fascinating talk. So I've been receiving some questions and I'll begin asking them, but if anybody else wants to add questions, please do so in the chat. So Teela, let me begin by kind of connecting what you talked about here, at least some of what you talked about in this rich talk, to what we were discussing in our previous panel. So in the previous panel, we were talking about stigma and different speakers were talking about stigmas of different groups. So the stigma of what we call in Hebrew, translation of a prostitution survivor. I don't know if that's a term that is used currently in the UK or not, or if you use a different one. I wasn't sure how to translate it exactly, but in Hebrew, soredet znut, soldot znut. And the stigma that they endure as well. So kind of the stigma of lived experience being a different lived experience and different approach to the issue of the regulation of sex work and prostitution, and just how to approach it in policy and in public discourse. So I was wondering if if this kind of discourse is happening in the UK, if you came across it in your research, and whether and really how to think about stigma in relation to the plurality of positions of people in the sex industry about their own experiences.
Okay, thanks for that, and really interesting. I think broadly speaking, less. It's probably much more popular in the US, but I think what I can connect with is this general notion of victimization. Okay, so we have particularly around rape victims, victimization, being a survivor in that sense. And there is work done in relation to a therapeutic context around that owning of that identity, which can be positive or negative for someone's recovery, for example. But I think the term, if you're thinking about language, that term of prostitute survivor is used a lot by abolitionists. More, I see, as a campaigning tool, as an identity that's seen to be something that reinforces the trauma, that it could be lived experience trauma or the ideological trauma that they want to refer to when talking about the sex industry. So I think in the UK context, that term, that notion of survivor ultimately connects to this ideology that the sex industry can only ever be violence against women. So I think that's the context in which it's used in the UK, if it's used in the UK and possibly in the US as well. But other people may be able to comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm kind of following up on that question, a kind of a question about language. There are many language wars happening at the moment in Israel about the sex industry, and there seems like there is no neutral term. You're talking about using a neutral term or neutralizing the terminology, and in these wars between opposing camps, or maybe not wars, strong discussions, passionate discussions, either using the term sex work or using the term prostitution or prostituted women or women in prostitution or people in prostitution or whatever we use. Everything has a kind of a baggage that comes with it. It seems like there is no neutral ground. And I'm wondering if you can identify a process within the UK where the term sex work is seen as neutral, or whether it was just a language thing, it was neutral to begin with, or I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, for sure. So in the UK, I mean, definitely isn't neutral at all. But I think increasingly, so what happened, there was a law in 2009, so the word prostitute and to be prostituted, it was discovered in virtually all of the laws. I think there was only one other that was related to infanticide, but in all of the laws that it was the only one that was gendered, and that was obviously seen to be not equal, and therefore the word prostitute was taken out of and was agreed to not be used in laws. So we have the term people involved in prostitution in our legal statutes from 2009 onwards, and that is generally the language of government. So the word prostitution is used, but it's people involved. And obviously in relation to male trans sex work, has really been pushed a lot in the UK around we need to at least have terms that include everybody or are not gender specific to women. So that happened, that's kind of happened over the last 10 years and continues. But I think in areas where evidence-based policy or evidence research is key, so particularly health, sex workers used, talked about police, sex workers are used. In practice, increasingly, the term sex work is used to be more neutral and nuanced, ultimately. So that's becoming more of an everyday expectation, I think. Can I say something?
It's interesting to see the kind of the journey language takes within social struggles and legislation as well, and in these spaces.
It takes a very, very long. It's a very long road, the change of language, but I think it's a really pertinent, and we have discussions in all kinds of policy arenas that go on and on, come back to the point, because ultimately in this area, language dictates ideology, doesn't it? So I think, one word can mean a whole range of ideological positions, I think. So, so I think increasingly neutrality is favoured. There's a couple of questions in the chat. One was about the swerfs. How do we respond to swerfs? And I don't, I'm someone who I'm not on Twitter, and have made that decision over the last 18 months to step away from that space as something that I feel is not particularly helpful to make significant changes. Obviously, if everyone did that, then we wouldn't be in a great position. So I'm not advocating that. That's just my personal point of view. And as my job changed, it became increasingly important for me to stay away from those spaces, so it didn't jeopardize other areas that I could influence. So, we have to think about, what those, certainly on Twitter and those social media spaces, what those spaces are being used for, and is it a useful way to use our energies and our limited resources? So I think it comes back to individuals and where people feel they can make the most change. Some people may think it's by responding to all the angry swerfs, but I'm not quite sure. I haven't seen it yet in relation to change through social media. A lot of it is angry noise, and I think it can ultimately really affect people trying to constantly engage on that on a personal level. So I don't have the answers to that question, but I think there's decisions to be made amongst organisations how they engage with those swerf attacks, but individuals need to think about how to protect themselves, I think, a little bit, and not think it's an individual's responsibility to take on that whole historical ideology that comes out through ultimately social media aggression. So the other question, Noor talked about hierarchies. Say something about hierarchies. So I think I haven't written particularly about this. I mean, Raven Bowen, who is the CEO at National Arguments and also an academic, she's written some really interesting work around duality and people who have square jobs and sex work jobs and their experiences, particularly around stigma and navigating those things. But I think hierarchies within sex work clearly exist in relation to many different things, particularly the types of sex work that people do. There's class issues, there's issues around migrancy and citizenship status, there's issues around colour and racism particularly. I think you find that a lot in relation to webcamming. Angela Jones's work there is really significant in relation to how sex workers of colour are discriminated against by platforms. So I think all these, if you like, everyday structural inequalities that people face are amplified in the sex industry and can create divisions. So I think thinking about the hierarchy can ultimately, in relation to stigma, we can think that some people are doubly stigmatized, trebly stigmatized, multiple stigmas. I think I talk about multiple stigmas, and that this is not a one size fits all. So somebody who may be in a different class or have social capital or do a different type of sex work may experience less stigma than other people. So I think the hierarchy is really quite important to think about when we're trying to understand who experiences stigma and in what ways. So thanks for raising that. I'm not sure if you've got a comment there, Noor. I mean, Noor, you're working in a fantastic project that generally deals with works with street sex workers. You may see that more evident.
Yeah, if I can jump and say something. So as I told you in one of the group meeting, the sex workers women group meetings, so the woman just came and talked about the stigma. She said, I don't know how to come here. I don't know what to say to people that I'm here. And we were like, even though we're still talking about stigma, but I think we talk about it in different ways. Like a lot of sex workers just bring it and we can relate to that and we can say something. And I feel it's a big change. It's more complicated in a lot of ways, but it's out there. And I think once it's out there, we can relate to that. And in my example, so when that woman say, I don't know what to say to people that I'm coming to this group. So we thought about, just say you're coming to your training program. And she doesn't have to say that she's coming to the organization and specific organization for sex workers. And she said that's what she used. So yeah.
Thank you, Noor. Another question that comes out of your talk is the power of law to affect stigma. And I think within legal scholarship, there is a question how powerful law can be that is at times looked at like a magic pill that is taken and then society will heal itself, either, from an abolitionist perspective, society would heal itself from prostitution, and from a kind of the decriminalizing perspective, society would heal itself from stigma. But we see that law does neither of these. I think even research in New Zealand and in the Netherlands and in Australia shows that stigma still exists even when laws decriminalizing or regulating prostitution pass. And we know that in on-demand jurisdictions, prostitution did not disappear. In fact, in a research that Nat and Guy, who are here, and I did about public opinion, we found that on-demand legislation in Israel was kind of collapsed within public image to an anti-prostitution bill, in the sense that sex workers themselves, people in prostitution themselves, the public thought they should be criminalized as well. It was kind of a slippage into that. So I'm wondering about your thoughts about the power of law. And I will also add here, Martha Nussbaum has this really powerful text called Beyond Reason and Prejudice, where she begins with the example of the opera singer and talks about how the opera singer was very, very much a stigmatized profession, and how today it's a kind of a revered form of art. And in that piece, she says it wasn't law that did that. It was something totally else. And I noticed that in your kind of roadmap, we didn't have education. We had academia, but not education. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about kind of the power of law and how destigmatization can be achieved.
Yeah, I'm not a legal scholar, so I can say this without kind of trying to obliterate my whole career, but ultimately, legal theory is very critical in this regard of putting the expectations on law to do things. But I think certainly in the UK context, if you look at the legal changes around homosexuality and how, of course, it's not like that's got rid of homophobia, but it's certainly made big changes. And we have that incredibly detailed now laws around equalities, which really do seep into our structures, organisations, workplaces, education. So over time, over 60, 70 years, there's been the real changes in relation to how we have to consider sexuality. And I totally take the points, and I'm sure I'm working closely with Gillian Abel in New Zealand at the moment on the sexual violence project. And of course, it's not like stigma doesn't exist there, but sex workers have a very different status, and they're entirely embedded in the employment system and the occupational health and safety system, and it is entirely ordinary for sex workers to do all the things that you would do in a mainstream job, and for police to treat, you very rarely get reports around police abusing their powers or not taking a crime against a sex worker seriously. We're working with sexual assault referrals, and it's just in New Zealand, it's just a real example of, because of the laws there, if a sex worker experiences a sexual assault, the whole case goes through the New Zealand Collective of Prostitutes, who work, the police are based in the NZPC, And it's just a really great example of how, where there is really strong legal support, then practices do have to follow. And of course, there's lots of cultural changes that need to happen. But I think New Zealand case does demonstrate since 2003 that there is a slow process of social and cultural meanings being adapted. So I think the law is the long route, okay, the long way, but an incredibly important structural way to bring about those changes. Education, you've mentioned there, really quite important. Again, we're so behind on that. Just think about sex education. I'm not sure how it works in Israel, but we're so behind even getting sex education right in schools. So that could easily be seen as a route, but just more generally, the issues around violence, gender-based violence, needs to be addressed through education, definitely. It's not about tell your daughters to be safe, it's about educate your sons not to be violent, right? So that's really important in relation to any issues in terms of sexuality and violence. So, but I am an advocate of legal change being really, really important. And just as we've seen with the Nordic model, driving an activity, sexual behaviour underground, and all the negativity that brings, we can see the opposite in terms of there is positivity around some more rights-based engagement with legal reform. So I will advocate, definitely that the law is an important pillar.
Thank you. And maybe one final question before our time runs out is about many of us here academics, about our role in academia. You talked about academia as an environment for sex workers, but also the kind of power, knowledge that we create. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the ways legal academic research can be destigmatizing or help in the process of destigmatization.
Yeah, it'd be really great to hear from any sex worker activists or sex workers about how they think about academia, what they think, what their experiences have been. It's very topical at the moment, I think, particularly as we get more sex work academics engaged. I've always been an advocate of participatory action research and those key principles around not working on a community, you work with a community, and despite the incredible constraints of working in academia, the bureaucracy of working in a university, the complexities of funding and timing of funding bids, etc., can often be quite exclusionary. But I do think research is a vehicle for engaging partnerships, and my partnerships have always been really strong and really bridge those spaces. I think I'm standing in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, obviously quite symbolic. It's always bridged those spaces between the police, the government, the Crown Prosecution Service, and sex work communities or survivor involvement groups, for example. So I think academia increasingly should be adopted as an ally, as a co-collaborator, and we move increasingly towards methodologies and principles of co-production as much as possible. And it's really great to see more NGOs engaging in research and having their own research officers. I think the European, what's it called, ESWA, European Sex Work Association. So it used to be called, I forgot now. But anyway, they've got a new research officer, which is fantastic to see it being developed, and hopefully that's happening in Israel as well. You've got sex workers leading on the research, and that's really quite important.
So thank you very, very much for this wonderful talk and for engaging in all of these issues. I think you really kind of brought a lot to the table that we'll pick up and continue with as we continue our discussions next week. So this is an oddly structured conference that is 3 weeks long, but it's only on Thursdays. So I want to invite all of you who are here to join us next Thursday on June 16th. another day of this conference, where we're going to talk about in-demand legislation, and we're going to talk about help and getting help within the sex industry. And I really, again, want to thank you very much, Teela, for this great talk, and thank you, all of you, for staying with us. And I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you again, Teela.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.